Welcome to Jewish Life. My name is Stewart Ain. Every week at this time, we present programs of particular interest to the Jewish community. The program is presented in cooperation with the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York. Today, we're going to be speaking about the St. Louis. That's that ship in 1939 that tried to take 900 Jewish passengers to freedom, getting out of Nazi Germany, and the boat went to the United States and went to Cuba and tried to get into Canada, was turned around and refused admission, and then went right back, and a number of them were killed by the Nazis when they did go back. And today we're going to be speaking about that. What brings it up is the death of Herb Carliner. He was one of the last survivors, we believe, of that on the ship. And today we're going to be joined by Gilda Spitz. She is from Toronto, born and raised in Toronto, the only child of Holocaust survivors from Poland and Romania. And she attended the University of Toronto and has a degree in English and French. And her husband, Peter, had 3 relatives aboard the St. Louis. She's now retired. She was wrote documentation for computer software. And so she's familiar with the technical side of this thing, as she's going to show us some slides and presentation that she does for groups talking about the St. Louis. Welcome to the program, Gilda.
Thank you very much, Stewart. It is a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to talk to your viewers all the way from Thornhill, Ontario, Canada.
Great, that's great. I'm glad you are. And yeah, as I said, the death of Mr. Carliner brought back the story, and I'm afraid a lot of people don't even know the story. So if you wouldn't mind, just tell us a little bit about, from your point of view, what really happened.
You may be surprised to see that the title of my presentation is not simply the St. Louis, but the Spitzes and the St. Louis. The voyage of the MS St. Louis in 1939 is a historical event, and I will be telling the story from a historical perspective. But it's also a family story, because 3 members of my husband's family, his father, aunt, and grandmother, were passengers on the ship. So I'm also going to tell the story from a people perspective, and I think it's a more interesting story that way. I can easily summarize the facts in 4 sentences. In May 1939, 3 months before the start of World War II, a ship called the MS St. Louis carried 907 German Jews away from Nazi Germany to safety in North America, or so they thought. The passengers carried visas issued by the Cuban government, but Cuba turned them away anyway. Then they begged for help from the United States, but the United States turned them away. Then they begged for help from Canada, and Canada turned them away too. But obviously there's more to the story than just that. Who were these people? Why were they leaving Germany? Why were they going to Cuba of all places? How did Canada and the United States get involved? And why didn't one of those countries show some compassion for desperate people who were obviously fleeing for their lives? For many German Jewish families, the thought of leaving the only home they had ever known was terrifying, but it was even more terrifying to stay. According to Britannica.com, quote, after Kristallnacht, the Nazi regime made Jewish survival in Germany impossible, unquote. But the Nazis also made it almost impossible for the Jews to leave. For example, some Jews were required to pay as much as 90% of their wealth as a departure tax. but that was money that they were going to need for all the expenses of an escape. Despite all obstacles, some families were able to find some safe havens. England, South America, Australia, and even Shanghai, China. Today, I will tell you about another option. In 1939, in the city of Breslau, a Jewish family had found a safe haven, or at least they thought they did, in Cuba. This is the story of the MS St. Louis and the Spitz family. The story starts with my husband's paternal grandfather, Georg Spitz, who later anglicized his name to George. He heard about a ship sailing from Germany to Cuba that was accepting Jewish passengers. The Cuban government was selling visas, and they were expensive. But George was fortunate to be able to buy the 4 visas that he needed for himself, his wife, Vera, his 16-year-old daughter, Ursula, nicknamed Ushi, she was almost always called Ushi, and his 14-year-old son, Eric. George paid about $200 to $300 in 1939 US dollars for each visa. Adjusted for inflation, he spent the modern equivalent of $15,000 to $20,000 just on the visas. In addition, George bought tickets for Cuba on 2 different ships. He bought one ticket for himself to sail at the end of April 1939. He wanted to sail to Cuba ahead of his family so that he could find a place to live and get settled before his family arrived. According to the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, Cuba offered the passengers, quote, a safe place to wait their turn until they could organize their passage to the US, unquote. He also bought 3 tickets for his wife and kids on a different ship that was sailing from Germany 2 weeks later, a ship called the MS St. Louis. The plan was for Vera, Ushi, and Eric to leave Germany on May 13th, 1939, and follow George to Cuba. The St. Louis was a luxury liner, and therefore it was an unusual vehicle for such a desperate escape. The ship was built in Germany, but it was named for the city St. Louis, Missouri, which explains why the name of the ship sounds American rather than German. The captain of the MS St. Louis was a man named Gustav Schroeder. Captain Schroeder was a German, but he was not a Nazi, and he was actually a very kind and decent man, as you will learn in the next few minutes. He started their voyage from Hamburg, Germany, with a passenger list of 907 German Jews. As shown by the red line on this map, after leaving Europe, he followed a direct route across the Atlantic to Havana, Cuba. Captain Schroeder ordered his German crew to treat their passengers with courtesy and respect. A radical idea for those times, considering what was happening back home in Nazi Germany, just 6 months after the terror of Kristallnacht. As a luxury liner, the St. Louis was roughly comparable to a present-day cruise ship, with dances and concerts for the adults, and activities and swimming lessons for the kids. On Friday evenings, the passengers were even allowed to hold Shabbat services in the dining room. There was a statue of Hitler in the dining room that could not be removed, but it was covered with a tablecloth so as not to offend the passengers. The voyage from Hamburg to Havana had a party atmosphere. You might be surprised to hear that, considering what was going on back home in Nazi Germany. But you must realize that these passengers thought they had hit the jackpot. They had escaped from Nazi Germany. They were traveling on a beautiful ship, and they were excited to start new lives in a safe place. In this photo, you can see Vera and her daughter Ushi standing near the railing, enjoying the fresh sea air during the crossing of the Atlantic. In this one, they are attending a dinner party for the adults. And 16-year-old Ushi must have felt she was old enough to hang out with the adults instead of with her little brother. In these photos, Ushi is spending time on deck with other passengers and enjoying and soaking up the sun as they got closer to Cuba. There are fewer photos of her brother Eric. However, we do have this one in which he is watching some sort of activity on deck, perhaps something like shuffleboard. This is a close-up of Eric. In this photo, Eric is attending a party with a younger crowd. Eric looks like he might be the youngest one in the whole group, but not too young to be holding a glass of champagne and a toast at the tender age of 14. Another child on the ship was Herb Carliner, a name that some of you may remember. Herb was 12 years old when he was on the ship with his parents. Eventually, Herb settled in the Miami area. In 1989, he organized a huge 50th anniversary commemoration of the St. Louis in Miami. The happy party atmosphere on the St. Louis came to an abrupt end when the ship arrived in Havana, Cuba. As I mentioned previously, the passengers carried visas issued directly by the Cuban government. Only 2 weeks earlier, when George Spitz had arrived, he had used his own visa to successfully enter the country. And of course, his wife and kids were carrying exactly the same visas. But Cuban President Federico Laredo Bru had just issued a law called Decree 937, which invalidated all recently issued visas for refugees. When the ship arrived in Havana, the refugees from Hamburg were shocked to discover that they were not allowed to disembark. There has been much speculation regarding the president's motives, resulting in more questions than answers. Did he sign Decree 937 because he wanted to protect jobs for native Cubans? Did he want bribe money before he would allow the refugees to enter the country? Was he influenced by political pressure from Nazi Germany? Or was he anti-Semitic? We don't have time today to explore all the details of these questions. Nonetheless, the results were clear. When the refugees arrived in Havana, they were shocked to discover that they were trapped on the ship, not allowed to disembark, with nowhere to go. The ship sat in Havana Harbor for 6 days. Just look at how close that ship was to the shore. But to those passengers, that shore might as well have been 1,000,000 miles away. Just for a minute, put yourself in their shoes. Back home in Germany, you suffered persecution from the Nazis for years. You experienced the terror of Kristallnacht, and you know that things are getting even worse. You want to find a safe place to raise your family, but where can you go? Then you hear about a miraculous opportunity to go to Cuba on a cruise ship. You somehow find the money to buy expensive tickets and visas. You sell your house and most of your belongings, and you pack the few things that you can carry with you. You say goodbye to your friends and relatives, not knowing whether you will ever see them again. You spend 2 weeks sailing across the Atlantic, celebrating your good fortune. You finally arrive at your destination, and then you are suddenly told that you are not permitted to cross that last tiny little bit of water. And then you realize if they won't let you off the ship in Cuba, that means you're going back to Nazi Germany and not to the home that you left in your old town. You are going straight to a concentration camp. Can you imagine how desperate those passengers felt? A passenger named Max Lowe tried to escape by slashing his wrists and jumping overboard. He was rescued and taken to a hospital in Havana and was probably the only refugee who actually set foot in Cuba.
Gilda, did he get to stay there? Did he get to stay?
Actually, much later, he ended up in England. And he met the rest of his family there in England.
Wow, wow.
In this photo, you can see anxious passengers in the St. Louis crowded at the railing, looking at a sanctuary that was suddenly out of reach. In this one, you can see friends and relatives who were already in Havana, such as George Spitz, using small rickety boats to approach the huge ship in the harbor. They were hoping to see their relatives at the railing above their heads. Meanwhile, Captain Schroeder spent those 6 days in Havana Harbor unsuccessfully negotiating with the Cuban government. On the 6th day, he finally ran out of options. He had his orders from his Nazi employers to bring the ship back to Germany. and the Cuban government wanted him to stop taking up valuable space in the harbor. So the captain was forced to leave Havana. He didn't want to take the ship back to Nazi Germany because he knew his Jewish passengers would be sent straight to concentration camps, but he had no choice. The situation was desperate. The purple line on this map shows his route across the Atlantic heading back to Nazi Germany. At first glance, it might look like the exact same route in reverse, but it was not. As you can see in this close-up, the captain started with a meandering detour off the coast of southern Florida. Many years later, Herb Carliner said, quote, "We were so close to Miami Beach, I could see it. I told my parents, someday I'll come back here," unquote. During this time, Captain Schroeder was trying to negotiate with American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to allow the refugees to disembark in the United States, but FDR refused. Roosevelt was personally sympathetic to their situation, but the general American population was not. FDR was afraid of a voter backlash at a time when he was considering running for a third term as president. After FDR's refusal, Captain Schroeder even considered the drastic move of deliberately damaging the ship by running it aground along the coast of Florida. His reasoning was, if he could prove that the ship was damaged and no longer seaworthy, he could force the American government to let the passengers disembark in the United States. But the US Coast Guard anticipated this strategy and made sure to keep the ship far away from the coastline. A few days after the refusal from Roosevelt, the ship passed relatively close to Canada. During this time, Captain Schroeder tried to negotiate with the Canadian government in the same way. Canada's Prime Minister at the time, William Lyon Mackenzie King, was even less sympathetic to Jewish refugees than FDR was. This was nothing new for Prime Minister King. He had a long history of anti-Semitism, and he had no intention whatsoever of allowing a boatload of Jewish refugees to land in Canada. But at the time that Captain Schroeder transmitted his request, the Prime Minister was busy with other official duties. So he deferred the decision to his Director of Immigration. Frederick Blair was a rabid anti-Semite, possibly even more so than Prime Minister King. An official in the Department of External Affairs was quoted as saying, "He was the single most difficult individual I have ever had to deal with. He was a holy terror," unquote. Blair was once asked how many Jews he would have been willing to allow into Canada, and he replied famously, "None is too many." Many years later, the phrase "none is too many" was used as the title of a book about the Jews of Europe from 1933 to 1948, including a description of the MS St. Louis affair. It records in detail Canada's long history of anti-Semitism and opposition to Jewish immigration in the 1930s and 40s. Because of the refusals from all three countries, Captain Schroeder was forced to continue east across the Atlantic, heading back to Nazi Germany. The party atmosphere from the first half of the voyage was gone. Now the passengers were depressed and terrified. Negotiations were held with various European countries as the ship came closer to Europe. Just in the nick of time, the governments of 4 generous countries, England, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, each agreed to accept approximately 25% of the passengers. Instead of returning to Nazi Germany, the St. Louis passengers were fortunate to dock in Antwerp, Belgium instead. Before they arrived in Belgium, a committee on the ship helped to place the refugees in the locations that they preferred. Vera Spitz told the committee that she and her children wanted to go to England. Vera couldn't foresee the future, but England turned out to be the safest place. The passengers who went to the other 3 countries weren't so lucky. World War II broke out less than 3 months later, and eventually Nazi Germany and its allies conquered almost all of continental Europe. Of the 619 passengers who went to France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, thinking they were safe, many of them ended up in Nazi concentration camps. Anyway, the tragic result that Captain Schroeder had been trying so hard to avoid. Within the next few years, 254 of those passengers were murdered in those concentration camps. Conversely, of the 288 passengers who went to England, almost all were still alive at the end of the war, including Vera, Uschi, and Eric Spitz. In the summer of 1939, George was able to join his family in London. After the war, Uschi and Eric met their future spouses and married them there. And in 1948 and 49, the entire extended family emigrated to Canada, a decade after the St. Louis was originally turned away. And that's the end of this chapter of their story, but not the end of the entire story. In the next few decades, the extended Spitz family established a life in Toronto. During those years, several events related to the voyage of the St. Louis occurred. In 1959, Captain Gustav Schroeder died at the age of 73. 13 years later, he was named as one of the righteous among the nations at the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial in Israel. This was a richly deserved honor considering how decently he treated his Jewish passengers and how hard he had worked to try to find a safe sanctuary for them, just in the face of indifference and anti-Semitism on both sides of the Atlantic. In 1976, a Hollywood movie called Voyage of the Damned was released, based on the events of the St. Louis. It starred Max von Sydow as Captain Schroeder, Faye Dunaway as a glamorous passenger, and Orson Welles as a sinister Cuban official. The movie took some minor liberties with the facts, but the basic storyline was accurate. In 2016, the novel The German Girl was published, also based on the events of the St. Louis. My favorite part is the last few pages, where the publisher printed the signatures of actual St. Louis passengers. In the list of passengers, you can find those of the three members of the Spitz family: mother Vera, daughter Uschi, and son Eric. Eventually, the governments of the United States and Canada issued official apologies for their actions. The American apology took place in 2012. The event was presided by Deputy Secretary Bill Burns and attended by 14 American survivors. The Canadian apology took place in 2018 in Ottawa and included a lengthy speech by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in the Parliament building. One Canadian survivor and approximately 200 children and grandchildren of survivors attended the event in Ottawa. In the case of the Spitz family, the three survivors had all died by then, but the two daughters of Uschi and the three sons of Eric, including my husband Peter, were invited. From those 5 children and their spouses, there's now a total of 44 valuable members of Canadian society. From our entire extended family, I'm pleased to say that 23 of us were able to make the trip to Ottawa, including Peter, me, and our son, Brian. These are photos of some of the members of our extended family with Prime Minister Trudeau. Despite the long line of people who all wanted to speak to him and take a photo with him, he was patient and attentive with everyone. In closing, I'm honored to be here to tell you the true stories about the passengers of the St. Louis. I am grateful that the Canadian government decided to issue this beautiful official statement of apology. Even if those words did come 79 years too late, they still matter because they tell a story that might otherwise be forgotten or disputed all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilda. What can you tell me now? The ship was supposed to have left all the passengers in Cuba or the United States or wherever. Did they have enough supplies on the ship going back? Food, water? How did they make out?
It's an interesting question. I have a contact at the American Holocaust Memorial Museum, and I asked her exactly the same question. She's a historian, and she specializes in the St. Louis. She could not answer that question. She didn't know. A very cynical thought, and I don't know whether this is accurate, is that the Nazis knew all the time that they were going to be coming back with a boatload of passengers. And if so, they had already loaded up the ship with all the supplies they needed for both ways. I don't know whether that's true. That's just a cynical suspicion of mine, but I really don't know. And this historian didn't know either.
Interesting. The ship, though, it was emblematic of what happened to the Jews of Germany, the restrictions, the quota system shut the doors for the Jews trying to flee, and that really said it all. There, you couldn't get out. You could not get out.
Yeah, some people did, as I said. There were some exceptions. Another branch of the Spitz family, actually Vera's sister and her family, went to Australia, and they are still there today. Actually, their daughter, who was 17 when she left Germany, just celebrated her 100th birthday in Melbourne earlier this year.
Tremendous. And some, as you said, went to Shanghai.
Yes,
right.
Yes, we do know people.
Manchuria, yes. And they took the Trans-Siberian Railroad to get there. And Japan, even though it was working with the Japanese, with the Germans, did not compel the Jews of Japan to leave. The Germans wanted them, kicked them out, and bring them to the concentration camps, and Japan refused, which is quite
surprising.
Yes.
Yeah. We do know a few people who did spend the war years in Shanghai, and then when the communist regime came in after the war, then most of them left and went across the Atlantic to either Canada or United States or South America.
Right. Very interesting. What is the most frequent question you get from audiences?
Peter, can you think of anything?
A lot of them ask what happened to Captain Schroeder when he went back to Germany. Was he punished for what he did?
Yeah, that's true. And the answer is no, he was not. And that's quite surprising. Apparently, he took the ship across the Atlantic and back one more time, having nothing to do with refugees, but just some other voyage. And that was his last voyage. He then was given a desk job.
Right. So he wasn't berated. He wasn't chastised.
As far as we know, no. Yeah, I'm glad you remember that, Peter, because I'd forgotten about that. Yeah. Right.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much, Gilda. Gilda Spitz. And this has been really quite an education for those who do not know about the St. Louis. But as you say, that was emblematic of what happened during the war, how the world basically closed the doors and told the Jews, you can't get out. And that's basically what Hitler said, look, go wherever you want. And when the world said they can't get out, Hitler said, okay, kill them. And that was the final solution.
It's very scary. And I'm guessing that, Stewart, were you born in the United States? Or were you?
Yes.
Yeah, but, and your parents?
Yes.
Yeah, you see, for us, almost everybody we know in our circle of friends are children of Holocaust survivors. Somehow, some of them did survive, and we are the result of that. And we're very lucky.
Very good. Well, thank you again. My name is Stewart Ain. This has been Jewish Life. Thank you, Gilda Spitz, and we appreciate you joining us. And I see Peter's just on. Peter is our husband, and this is the story of his family. Well, I thank you very much. It's great to see you.
It's our pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for inviting us.
Until next week, have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.